before the first passenger ever bought a ticket, before the first locomotive ever crossed a continent, a small group of engineers, lawmakers, and disaster survivors sat down and wrote rules. Rules born from wreckage, from panic, from the sheer terrifying reality of what happens when a 50-ton machine moving at 30 miles per hour has no way to stop. What they wrote down in the 1800s, we still follow today. Rule 1. The standard gauge, the measurement that refused to die. There is a number that almost every railway engineer on Earth knows by heart: 4 feet, 8.5 inches. Or in metric, 1,435 millimeters. It is the width between the two rails that your train rides on. It sounds like a precise, carefully calculated, scientifically optimized figure. And yet the story of how that number came to rule the world is one of the most wonderfully accidental tales in engineering history. In the early 1800s, railway gauges were a free-for-all. Every region, every mine operator, every ambitious engineer had their own idea of how wide the track should be. In England alone, you had gauges ranging from 4 feet all the way to the magnificent 7 feet, chosen by the brilliant and stubborn Isambard Kingdom Brunel for his Great Western Railway. In the United States, the situation was even more chaotic. By the 1860s, only about half of the country's railway miles matched what we now call the standard gauge. The South predominantly used a 5-foot gauge. The North had its own patchwork of measurements. Getting freight from one railway to another often meant unloading every single car and reloading it onto a different set of wheels. It was expensive, slow, and deeply frustrating. Then came the Civil War. For the first time in history, a major armed conflict depended on railways to move troops and ammunition across vast distances at speed. And suddenly, the problem of gauge differences was not merely a commercial annoyance, it was a matter of life and death. The Union held a significant advantage because its rail network was far more interconnected. The Confederacy, with its different gauge, could not as easily shift materials from one line to another. The war made it brutally clear that a nation with a fragmented rail gauge system was a nation at strategic risk. The decision to standardize came from a man named George Stephenson, who had been advocating for his preferred measurement for decades before America fully listened. Stephenson was a coal mine worker turned mechanical genius from northeast England, and the width he chose for his railways traced back to the spacing used on horse-drawn coal wagons in his region. In 1829, his locomotive designs for the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, the world's first intercity steam railway, used 4 feet 8.5 inches, and the success of that line shot Stephenson to international fame. American railroads, many of which imported early equipment from Britain, simply matched the gauge that came with the machines they bought. After the Civil War, the standardization movement accelerated rapidly. In 1886, over the course of just 2 days, May 31st and June 1st, the railways of the American South coordinated a massive simultaneous operation in which thousands of workers physically shifted one rail on every broad gauge line inward by 3 inches, converting the entire southern network to near standard gauge in a single weekend. It was one of the most remarkable coordinated engineering events in history. By 1886, standard gauge had effectively won, and it has not lost since. Today, roughly 55% of the world's entire railway network uses the exact same 4 feet, 8.5-inch spacing that George Stephenson settled on 2 centuries ago. Every high-speed rail line in France, Germany, Spain's new network, China's vast bullet train system, and the entire railway grid of North America, all run on the same measurement, first formalized in the 1800s. Modern bullet trains capable of 300 kilometers per hour run on a gauge that was set in stone before the invention of the light bulb. The measurement was written in the 1800s. The world simply never found a good enough reason to change it. Rule 2. 1 train per block. The law that was written in blood in the earliest days of railways. Keeping trains from running into each other was handled the way you might expect from an industry that was making everything up as it went. A man stood by the track with a watch. He was called a railway policeman, which is where the British slang term bobby for a signalman actually came from. His job was simple, in theory. After one train passed, he would wait a set number of minutes, usually 5, before letting the next train enter the same section of track. This was called the time interval system. The problem was equally simple to see. In hindsight, the system assumed that every train ran on time, that no train ever broke down, and that 5 minutes of head start was always enough separation. In reality, none of those things were reliably true. When a train stalled on a gradient in fog or rain, the train behind it had no idea. The policeman at the previous station had already waved it through because 5 minutes had passed, and so collisions happened. Terrible ones, the kind that investigators described in reports, that used careful Victorian language to describe scenes that were anything but. The principle that replaced the time interval system was called the block system, and its rule was absolute. Only one train may occupy any given section of track at one time. No exceptions based on scheduling assumptions. No trust placed in a man with a pocket watch. Physical confirmation that a section was clear before any train was allowed to enter it. The block system worked by dividing the railway into sections, blocks, each guarded by a signal. That signal showed red when a train was in the block ahead. It showed clear only after positive confirmation had been received, either mechanically or electrically, that the previous train had fully cleared. The signals were physically interlocked with the points and switches, meaning that it became mechanically impossible to set a signal to clear while simultaneously routing another train onto a collision course. The interlocking was not a rule you had to remember to follow. It was built into the hardware. Human error was removed from the most critical decisions. The Regulation of Railways Act of 1889 in Britain made absolute block working compulsory across the network, following a catastrophic accident at Armagh in Ireland that year, where a runaway excursion train carrying children collided with a following service, killing 80 people. Before that accident, the block system had been recommended for decades. After Armagh, it became law, and it remains law today. The fundamental principle, one train, one block, at any given time, sits at the heart of every modern railway signaling system on Earth. From the semaphore signals still used on some heritage lines to the digital moving block systems used on high-speed rail networks, the technology that enforces the rule has changed beyond recognition. The satellites, computers, transponders, and radio systems that modern railways use would be incomprehensible to the Victorian engineers who designed the first interlocking frames, but the rule itself has not changed a single word. One section of track, one train. The 1800s wrote that rule. Every railway in the world still obeys it. Rule 3, the automatic air brake. A failure must always stop the train. In the early railroad era, stopping a train was not the engineer's job alone. It was everybody's job. Brakemen rode on the tops of the cars in all weather, at speed, on moving trains, and when the engineer blew a signal on the whistle, those men ran along the rooftops of the carriages, reaching down to manually crank the brake wheel on each individual car. A train of a dozen cars required a dozen separate brake applications, all coordinated by a system of whistle signals and sheer athleticism. Men died doing this work constantly. One brakeman injury report from the 1880s estimated that roughly 1,000 brakemen were killed and 5,000 injured every single year in the United States alone, mostly from falls. A young man from New York named George Westinghouse decided this was unacceptable. In 1869, at age 23, he filed a patent for a device that would change railways forever: the automatic air brake. The genius of Westinghouse's design was not simply that it used compressed air to apply brakes across all the cars simultaneously from the locomotive cab. The true genius was in what happened when something went wrong. Westinghouse engineered his system so that it was the presence of air pressure that kept the brakes released, and the absence of air pressure that applied them. This meant that if anything broke, if a coupling failed, if a hose burst, if a car separated from the rest of the train, the brakes automatically engaged on every car without any human action required. The system's default state was stopped. You had to actively maintain it in motion. This principle is known as fail-safe design, and it was codified into law by the Railway Safety Appliance Act of 1893, which made air brakes mandatory on all American rolling stock. The basic logic of that 1869 invention is still built into the brake systems of every freight train and passenger train operating today. Loss of brake pipe pressure still triggers an emergency brake application. The principle that the failure of any part of the system must result in the train stopping, not continuing, is a rule that has been enshrined in railway engineering since the 1800s and has not been replaced, only refined. Modern freight trains in North America still use a system that would be fundamentally recognizable to Westinghouse. The valves are more sophisticated, the materials are different, and electronic controls overlay the pneumatic systems on passenger trains. But the core rule, a broken brake pipe stops the train, is the same rule that was patented in 1869. It has survived every technological revolution the railways have passed through because no one has found a safer alternative to a system that defaults to stopping when it detects a problem. Rule 4. The whistle code. Speaking without words, before radios, before electronic communication of any kind, before even the telegraph was universally available to train crews on the move, there was the whistle. The whistle was the locomotive's voice, and like any language, it needed to be shared. In the very early years of railways, each company wrote its own code. A long blast on the Baltimore and Ohio meant something entirely different from a long blast on the London and Southwestern. This was a problem that grew increasingly dangerous as railway networks expanded and crews began working across different lines. A misunderstood whistle signal in a busy yard or at an approaching crossing was not a small miscommunication. It was the kind of miscommunication that ended in collision. The push for a standardized whistle code was part of the broader movement toward universal operating rules that swept through the American railway industry in the second half of the 1800s. Railway companies that had each operated as independent fiefdoms with their own rules, their own equipment specifications, and their own ways of doing things were slowly brought into a shared framework. The General Code of Operating Rules eventually gave North American railroads a common language. The whistle codes that emerged from that standardization process were elegant in their simplicity. Short blasts and long blasts in specific sequences conveyed specific meanings. 2 long blasts meant the train was about to start forward. 3 short blasts meant it was about to reverse. The succession of short rapid blasts was the distress signal help needed immediately. And the most famous code of all, the grade crossing approach signal, 2 long blasts, 1 short, 1 long, was required to be sounded every single time a locomotive approached a public road crossing where someone might be about to walk or drive across the tracks. Today, that last one is still the law. The Federal Railroad Administration in the United States requires locomotive engineers to sound the horn in the long, long, short, long pattern when approaching grade crossings. The specific sequence is essentially unchanged from the codes developed and standardized in the 1800s. The sound is different. Modern locomotives use compressed air horns rather than steam whistles, but the pattern is identical. 2 long, 1 short, 1 long. Every train engineer who goes to work in America today learns and uses a code that was written before the automobile existed. The whistle itself was invented as a safety device, specifically because trains were dangerous to pedestrians and road users who could not hear them coming. A man named Adrian Stevens is credited with developing an early version in the 1800s. Within decades, the whistle and its codes became so standard that they were absorbed into law. They remain in law today. One of the clearest examples of a 19th century communication system that modern technology has not managed to fully replace. Because no radio message can be heard by a pedestrian without a receiver. Rule 5. The block post and the signalman's authority. A man or a machine must always know. One of the oldest and most foundational rules in railway operation is deceptively simple. At every significant junction, division point, or potential conflict in the network, there must be a controlling authority who knows the state of the track on both sides before any movement is permitted. In the 1800s, that authority was a person, the signalman, in his signal box. Today, it might be a computer sitting in a central control room. But the rule that an authority must exist must have confirmed knowledge of the state of the line, and must give positive permission before a train moves, has never been removed from the rulebook. The signal box, a raised cabin positioned at a junction or station with a clear view of the surrounding track, and a frame of large mechanical levers controlling signals and points, was one of the great inventions of Victorian railway safety. Before signal boxes, individual items of equipment were often operated by different workers, with no coordination between them. A pointsman changed the switch. A flagman showed the signal. Neither necessarily knew what the other had just done. The mechanical interlocking frame changed this by physically connecting the levers controlling signals and points so that dangerous combinations became physically impossible to select. You could not unlock the signal for a train to proceed if the points were set against it. The machinery would not allow it. The first mechanical interlocking in Britain was installed at Bricklayers' Arms. Junction in London in the 1840s, it was a revelation. Instead of relying entirely on the correct judgment and memory of individual workers who might be tired, distracted, or confused, the system embedded safety into the physical structure of the equipment. This was the beginning of what engineers now call inherent safety, building the protection into the system itself rather than relying on people to always make the right choice. The Regulation of Railways Act of 1889 made interlocked block working compulsory across Britain. Similar mandates followed in the United States over the following decades, and the principle has never been abandoned. Today's computer-based interlocking systems, where route-setting computers manage hundreds of trains across thousands of track segments, trace their logic directly back to the Victorian interlocking frame. The rule is the same. No train may enter a section until the controlling authority has positively confirmed the section is clear and set the route safely. The computer is faster and more comprehensive than any signalman, but it is doing exactly the same job, following exactly the same rule that was written in the 1800s. Rule 6. The dead man's principle. The operator must be alert or the train must stop. This rule has a name that sounds dramatic and old-fashioned, but its logic is as sound today as it was when the first versions were designed. The dead man's principle holds that a train must not continue operating if the driver is incapacitated. If the person in charge of the locomotive becomes unable to control it, whether through sudden illness, injury, unconsciousness, or death, the train must apply its brakes automatically without waiting for anyone to notice. The earliest steam railways did not formally codify this because there was always more than one person on the footplate. The driver and the fireman worked together, and if one became incapacitated, the other could take action. But as electric trams and then single-driver rapid transit systems were introduced in cities toward the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s, the problem became acute. A single person in an enclosed cab with no second crew member could render a fully loaded passenger train completely uncontrolled if they suffered any kind of medical emergency. The solution was a physical device. Originally, a lever, button, or pedal that the driver had to maintain constant pressure on in order for the train to move. Release the pressure, and the brakes applied. In some early designs, it was literally just a handle that, when released, cut power and applied the emergency brakes. Later versions became more sophisticated, requiring the driver to periodically respond to audible alerts, proving not just that they were alive, but that they were alert and consciously engaged with the operation of the train. The principle became a formal operating requirement through a combination of accident reports and regulatory mandates in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and it has been part of railway safety law in virtually every country ever since. Modern trains are equipped with what are called driver safety devices, which are sophisticated vigilance systems requiring ongoing confirmation of an alert human operator. The technology behind them has evolved dramatically. Some systems now monitor the driver's eye movements. Others use touch-sensitive controls that detect the warmth and pressure of a human hand. But the rule, the train must stop itself if the driver fails to respond, is identical to the principle first formalized in the 1800s. It is simply non-negotiable. An unmanned train must not be allowed to run. The rule ensures it cannot. Rule 7. Railway time. The law that one clock rules all. This one begins not with a crash, but with confusion, and it ended up reshaping how the entire world tells time. In the early 1800s, time was local. Every city, every town, every village set its clocks by the position of the sun. Bristol, England, was approximately 10 minutes behind London. A city 100 miles to the west might be 20 minutes behind. For most of human history, this was fine. People did not move fast enough for the difference to matter. Railways changed that completely. A locomotive could cover the distance between two towns with significantly different local times in under an hour. Timetables became nearly impossible to publish meaningfully. When a railway company said its train would depart at 11 o'clock, passengers in different towns had 11 o'clock at different actual moments. Missed connections, wrong platform arrivals, and genuine scheduling disasters began to pile up. And when two trains were scheduled to be on the same track at different times, but those times were measured by different local clocks, the confusion moved from inconvenient to dangerous. The solution came first from the railways themselves. British Railways began adopting a single standard, initially called railway time, synchronized to Greenwich Mean Time, starting in the 1840s. By 1855, the vast majority of British towns had adopted GMT as their own standard. Not because the government required it, but because the railway had made local time functionally unworkable. In North America, the situation was even more fragmented. By the early 1880s, American railroads were operating under more than 50 separate time standards, each created by individual railway companies for their own lines. At noon on November 18, 1883, the North American railway industry unilaterally implemented a system it called Railroad Standard Time, dividing the continent into 4 time zones running east to west. This was not a government decision. The railways simply announced it, implemented it, and the rest of the country largely fell in line because the railways were how the country ran. The United States Congress did not formally adopt the Standard Time Act, legally establishing the 4 time zones for the nation. Until 1918, 35 years after the railways had already created the system and made it work. The worldwide adoption of time zones, which now governs every aspect of international commerce, travel, communication, and coordination, began because railway operators in the 1800s needed their timetables to make sense. The rule that railways established that all operations on a given network must operate under a single, synchronized time standard, not local variations, is still enforced today on every railway network on Earth. Train dispatchers work from atomic clock synchronized time references. GPS systems on modern trains use time signals accurate to nanoseconds. The technology is wildly more precise than a telegraph-synchronized station clock in a Victorian railway terminus. But the principle, one time everywhere on the network, with no local variations, is the same rule. The railways wrote in the 1840s and 1850s. They invented it because they needed it. The world adopted it because it turned out to be the only sensible way to organize time at scale. 7 rules. Written in the 1800s by people who were building something the world had never seen before, often learning through failure what the right answers were. They did not have the benefit of computer modeling, simulation software, or a century of accident analysis. They had observation, engineering instinct, political pressure from disasters, and the hard, practical knowledge of what happened when you got something wrong on a railway. What they built, the standard gauge, the block system, the fail-safe brake, the whistle code, the interlocked signal authority, the dead man's protection, and synchronized railway time, turned out to be so fundamentally correct that the entire modern railway industry still rests on it. Not as a historical curiosity, not as a tribute to the past, but as the actual operating framework that keeps millions of passengers safe every single day. The locomotives have changed, the signals have changed. The materials, the speeds, the distances, all of it has changed beyond recognition. The rules have not. And that, more than anything, tells you how right those engineers got it the first time.